Hi, everyone. I'm here with Sam Polk, the founder and CEO of Everytable. I'm a huge fan of the business that they've built and the way that they're creating greater access and affordability to healthy eating and good food. Sam, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And for those of you who don't know what Everytable is, do you mind giving us an overview of what you guys do?
Sure. Everytable is basically a fresh prepared food business that is, solving the problem of, the fact that healthy food has become a luxury product instead of a human right. So we've basically sort of restructured, you can call it the restaurant business in order to, make a restaurant system and a healthy vending machine system and a home delivery system such that healthy, fresh, delicious, made from scratch meals are often less than the price of fast food. The other thing that we do is we have a variable pricing model so that if we open a store in Brentwood or a more affluent community, we'll charge $7 or $8. Totally great deal. But when we open a store in Compton or Watts or South Los Angeles or any other underserved neighborhood, we'll charge $5 or $6 for that same meal. And it's not charity, by the way. It's really about creating a system that works for everyone.
Beautiful. And I'm a fan of the system and how you guys have really flipped it on its head in terms of the business model. And I think the journey to how you got there is super fascinating to me. Your background is really interesting. How did you get into starting Everytable?
I mean, I guess it all started. So I was a hedge fund trader, senior hedge fund trader for one of the largest hedge funds when I was 30, and it was a great job. But when I had sort of finally gotten to the position I'd worked my whole life for, I sort of had you could call it like a crisis of conscience. And I was reading a lot of civil rights stuff at the time, Taylor Branch's 3-part series on Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. And I was just sort of blown away by the courage of that movement. And also, how so many of the problems that they were trying to solve were still sort of very much in effect today. And so that was sort of the first step, which sort of led me to leave Wall Street. And then a couple of years later, when I was sort of figuring out what I was going to do, my wife and I sat down and watched a bunch of sort of Netflix food documentaries. And, kudos to the people who made those movies where, they really set out to like inspire a generation, and they did. And there's so many people in the food space who were sort of inspired by those movies. And I was just one of them.
Which movies were those?
Well, the ones I watched, everybody's watched Food Inc. and Forks Over Knives, but the one that really got me was this movie that was made by a woman named Lori Silverbush. She's actually Tom Colicchio's wife, but, that's not even that important. She's an incredible documentary filmmaker, and she made this movie called A Place at the Table, and it was the first one that really made this sort of like clear, cogent argument about the intersection of food and poverty, and how, in certain neighborhoods, there's, no access to fresh, healthy food and tons of fast food. And so partially as a consequence of that, a kid born in, neighborhoods like that will live, sometimes 11, 12 years less than, people in more affluent communities. And for whatever reason, that was, it was like a clarion call that was like, healthy food should be a human right and not a luxury product. And yet we live in a world where that is the opposite. So what can we do to fix it?
Yeah. And I found that your transition from starting a nonprofit in the food space into starting what some people might call a social enterprise, or I don't know, a business in the conscious capitalism space, or a B Corp. Maybe you guys aren't officially a B Corp, but starting a business that takes into consideration multiple stakeholders, from the people on your team, to the farmers, to your end customers. I find that evolution interesting because a lot of people think that you can only create change and impact by starting a nonprofit.
Yeah, and it's almost sort of the complete opposite. And I don't mean that like, the people that I sort of have the highest admiration for in the world are a lot of the people that I've met in the sort of nonprofit world doing this sort of grueling and, difficult work on a day-to-day basis in a system that sort of by its very nature, means that they're sort of, getting paid pennies on the dollar, basically. But one of the things that I found, like I started a nonprofit, just like you said, where I was like, well, I want to do some good in the world. So, I guess I got to start a nonprofit. But it turns out that, a nonprofit is just sort of like a tax designation, which basically says if donors invest in you, then they don't get taxed on that investment. And that's all it is. But if you think about what that really means, it means that the focus is on sort of capital efficiency for the donor on some level. And it's not that, philanthropists are bad. We have a lot that support us now, and we basically, do a lot of business with foundations and some incredibly generous people. And at the same time, sort of whoever designed this sort of like startup nonprofit structure almost sort of designed it to fail on some level, because, it's hard enough sort of, you talk about multiple stakeholders, and that's true. And, in business, there's almost like one stakeholder that's the most important, and that's the customer, which is going to determine whether your business works or not. But in nonprofits, it's a little bit diluted, where your customer, quote unquote, is probably the person that you're trying to serve, or the group of people that you're trying to serve. But in order to do that, you have to go to these donors, and you don't have to go to these donors just once or twice or 5 times in order to get startup capital. You've got to go to them every single year for your entire budget. And that basically means that, first of all, your end customer is actually that philanthropist, because that's the person determining whether you're going to stay in business. And then 2, I've raised sort of, a good amount of money sort of in my life, both from donations and from investors. And I'll tell you, it's just easier to raise investor capital. If you can promise somebody that you'll turn, their $10 into 100, it's a lot easier than saying, give me this $10 and it'll disappear and you'll feel good about yourself. And I'm not anti-philanthropy. I think there's, some of the biggest problems in the world are solved by nonprofits, but there's a lot more sort of scalable impact that comes from for-profit businesses. Like, you can name 10 companies that 10 years ago didn't exist and now are worth $30 billion and impact everybody in the world, Uber, Airbnb, et cetera. And in nonprofits, there's just not that. It's harder to get there.
Yeah, and I've also heard you speak about entrepreneurs and the types of problems that they're solving, and having more entrepreneurs solving problems for a class of people or group of people that are underserved. Can you speak a little to that, and where you think business should be going in terms of people who are starting businesses, and the why and the how?
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you one story that I don't even know if I should tell, but I once interviewed a guy for like a marketing job, and he told me this story about, how somebody, basically a friend of his, had such respect in underserved communities that he could walk through these communities without, ever getting sort of like pushed around or anything. And the underlying premise to his story was that, underserved neighborhoods are dangerous, and that you've got to be very sort of careful when you're walking through them. And what I said to him is, I basically said, and I don't mean to be like, tooting my horn, but I was like, that's a very racist story, just so you know, and we didn't hire him, obviously. And the reason I tell you that story is, like, a lot of capital is like that, right? Like the people that have capital, and you can look at the numbers, racial wealth gap, et cetera, are, affluent people, mostly of the white sort of, ethnicity, that often came from sort of like more well-off backgrounds. And one thing a lot of those people have in common is that they don't have a lot of experience in underserved communities. But what's interesting is that underserved communities, at least, I mean, it's hard to speak of them as a general class, but I will say they are just communities filled with a lot of people trying to make a sort of good life for themselves. And there's so much sort of opportunity to partner with people in those communities to solve some of the very real problems that they're facing. And there's so much sort of, on a weird level, there's actually less competition in those neighborhoods. So it's even advantageous for the entrepreneur. But mostly what happens is that people stick to what they're comfortable with and comfortable in. And so you get a lot of investments in, things that make life just a little bit easier for affluent people and sort of white collar jobs. And, my belief is that, those people are plenty comfortable, me included, and maybe we should focus our attention on bigger problems.
Totally. And I think we have enough dating apps. Love is important, but if you're thinking about starting a dating app for dogs, maybe you can talk to Sam and find another idea or another problem to solve. In terms of like partnering with local communities, because I think some of us have the idea, there's the Tom's model of like going out, buy one, give one. And there's this sort of difference between giving someone something or teaching a man or a woman how to fish. Can you give some examples of how you partnered with local communities in order to make sure that you're not harming these communities, but actually giving them something of service and of value?
Yeah, I think that there's sort of two things I guess I would say on that, which is that the problem with the sort of well-intentioned Tom's model is that there's still an us and a them instead of creating a world where it's all us, basically. And, the thing about, and that is sort of like, it is sort of that sort of mindset that is the reason behind the second thing I'm going to say, which is that, a lot of folks in underserved, neighborhoods will likely agree that one of the most dangerous things in the world is a well-meaning white person trying to do some good, basically. And so and I don't mean to say that we've solved this in any way or figured it out, but what we have done sort of from the beginning is to try to sort of like walk in with a lot of humility, and the humility both means like, even with sort of like what you said, sort of like teaching a man to fish, it's actually less about that. It's less this assumption that I have knowledge that would benefit you, and more the assumption of what can we do together, and how can we partner with you to solve problems that you think that you have, not problems that necessarily that I think you have, basically. And in some level, like, it's like, as a kid, we used to hear this phrase, come correct, basically, into a neighborhood. And that's just what we try to do, which is basically like come in with a tremendous amount of respect, spend the time, build the relationships, build the trust over years and years and years, without sort of expecting anything and without sort of setting it up to sort of like profit off of it. Like, I'll tell you that this is a sort of like counter example to what I'm saying, but we recently had a company that make a nice donation to us. And as part of that, we did sort of like a photo shoot, and that I did it. So I'm here to tell you I'm a hypocrite, basically, but it was also like, there was, and I know I'm going to get in trouble talking about this, but it was still like, there was still this sort of attitude, the very structure of that sort of represents a lot of sort of social impact work, which is like, let me sort of, do some good, but also maximize the value that I'm getting for myself from doing that good. And, I don't mean to sound like a judgy McJudgerton, critical guy, because I'm not, because I'm supportive of everybody that is trying to do sort of good in this world and do the best they can, and we can, and this goes for me too. But at the same token, I do think that people can smell, when you're sort of trying to profit off of it for yourself, as opposed to just sort of generally trying to, it's not even be of service. It's just to sort of be a partner too. And like, Tavis Smiley, who was actually a founding board member of this company, he wrote a book and about basically the last year of Martin Luther King's life, and it was dedicated to I'm sad that I forget the guy's name, but it was a white gentleman that was a civil rights activist that got killed, in the sort of like, civil rights marches down in Montgomery, Alabama. And his point in dedicating that was, this is not something, making the world a more just and equal place isn't something that is only sort of the job of, the communities that are trying to help themselves. And it's certainly not the job of sort of like well-meaning white people. It does sort of take everybody, and all of that should be celebrated. It's just that you do have to sort of come in sort of, aware of, histories of sort of like, predatory colonialism sort of in the name of sort of doing good, basically.
I'd love to zoom out a little bit in terms of giving people a better understanding of the problem. Because I think, and not just the problem in terms of food access, but the problem in terms of the food system and how food is produced. And
it's so fascinating. It really is. I mean, so, well, I would say that to start off with, like, what the problem is, like, basically what happens when you start.
And sorry, because when I heard you talk about this, the consumer package, and I'm sure you'll get there, but just to like give a little insight into the direction. When I heard you speak, I worked in the consumer package industry, the CPG world. You could think of ketchups, chips, pretzels, things that are non-perishable. And then when I heard you connect the dots between the world of the non-perishable, the middle aisle of the supermarket, and the connection between that and fast food, it like all clicked for me in my head, and I'm hoping that you could make that click for others who haven't connected those dots yet.
Yeah, I mean, let's start with, before you get into the sort of business models underlying, like, let's start with what the actual sort of problem is. And this is, I think, sort of an interesting thing where when people hear about this issue of food deserts, what they invariably, and I mean this with no disrespect, but their first idea is, let's get a food truck carrying produce and drive it into underserved communities. But if you really stop for a second and think about it, like, that makes literally no sense, because it's not like there's grocery stores 5 miles away, and it's not like those grocery stores don't have, there's not real estate in underserved areas, and they couldn't get fruit and vegetables in them. And in fact, one of the things about most food desert, neighborhoods is that there's actually a lot of grocery stores, not as many as you might want, but a lot. The issue is not produce. And if you think about your own life, my guess is that not that frequently do you get a whole thing of bok choy and just chop it up and figure out what to do with it. The way that you eat healthy, the way that most people in sort of affluent neighborhoods eat healthy, is they go to Sweetgreen. They go to the Whole Foods prepared bar. They go to one of the juice stores in their neighborhoods. They go to Tender Greens, Lemonade, Dig In, Buy Chloe, like name it what you want. It's people preparing food for you. But the bottom line is that what is not in underserved areas is not the produce, it's any sort of fresh, healthy, prepared food. And this gets to the sort of reason I was talking about the sort of CPG world, which is that the largest food businesses in the country, and really the way that the entire food system has been built, is based on basically like CPG businesses and fast food businesses. And the reason those businesses are the dominant sort of food businesses in the food world is because they have figured out how to sell food really inexpensively. And the way they do it is actually sort of bizarrely the same. What they do is they basically have centralized production and national distribution. So if you think about, for example, the maker of Corn Pop cereal will be, have a single factory where they're producing all of the Corn Pops in the world. And if you imagine that factory, it's got incredible economies of scale and incredible efficiencies, probably automated sort of robots moving things from here to there. They're probably producing tens, if not hundreds of thousands of boxes of Corn Pops every day at the most sort of efficient unit economics you could ever get to. And then they're putting those boxes onto trucks or airplanes and taking them all over the country where they sit on retailers' shelves until they're sold. And the beauty of it for the retailers is that those businesses are those products are non-perishable, so they can sit in inventory for months without any risk. The beauty of it for the consumers is because there's the economies of scale and efficiencies from centralized production, and because there's no waste, because the food is non-perishable, you can get to incredibly low prices. And that's, my argument as to why the center of a grocery store, the 80% of a grocery store is shelf-stable products. It's not because people love shelf-stable products. It's because that's the best business for the retailer, and it's the lowest price point for the consumer. And what people love is low prices. And the same thing is true for fast food. Like, you think of fast food as a restaurant. It's not a restaurant. It's the end of a national supply chain where basically everything in a fast food restaurant was made in a factory and then sent all over the country. So you can imagine, like, frozen fries for McDonald's, and soda and ketchup and frozen beef, and the buns for McDonald's. Guarantee there's one or two factories making all those buns and then sending them everywhere. And the reason they can do that is because the entire supply chain is non-perishable. The problem is that when you get to perishable products, you cannot realize, or at least until Everytable, those same economies of scale. Because if you think about, for example, like a Sweetgreen restaurant, think about the ingredients for Sweetgreen coming into Los Angeles. They're probably, vegetable kale and carrots coming in on a truck and then distributed to the restaurant level, where at the restaurant level, they're cut and cooked and processed and sold to a customer. And so if you start thinking about a Sweetgreen restaurant as a food production facility, it's literally by definition like the least efficient food production facility you could find. It's literally like in the most high rent district. You've got, for each, let's say there's 20 different Sweetgreens, each one of them has their own kitchen, has their own equipment, has their own team. So no economies of scale that are able to be leveraged across multiple geographies. It's literally the most local thing. And the reason they set it up that way is because you can't really make a Sweetgreen salad in Los Angeles and send it to Chicago. In fact, you can't really make a Sweetgreen salad in Brentwood and send it to Silver Lake, And so what Everytable has done is basically said, look, we're going to take the principles from fast food of centralized production and national distribution, but do it with fresh food. And, we can tell you all about how we do that. But
isn't that changing though, Sam? Like, you look at companies like, I don't know, I think they're still in somewhat of stealth mode. Travis from Uber's business, Cloud Kitchens. And then we work with a company who's one of our early clients, Ordermark, would just raise the big round and is doing Next Bite as a business in terms of the virtual cloud kitchen space. And then I've even heard of, Sweetgreen being a customer of Cloud Kitchen, and everyone is kind of maybe following Everytable's lead.
It's not, first of all, what I would say just on those two businesses, like, I think Ordermark and sort of Next is brilliant. I really do. And the reason is, like, I'm sort of like a person that just loves sort of like efficiency, like, and sort of like unlocking sort of latent like economic power. It's why I think the sort of like Airbnb model was so sort of brilliant. It was like all these things just sitting there that all of a sudden could be sort of like, commercialized in some level. And so Ordermark is, for those of you who don't know, Ordermark basically is brands, and then they just like basically franchise those brands out to restaurants. So then the restaurants can make sort of two restaurants worth of food, and sort of like, capitalize on multiple day parts. But anyways, to your point, the thing that I think about when I think about those businesses is kitchens. And when the way that you unlock value and price in food production, and this is what all the CPG guys know, it's what all the fast food guys know, is with high volume on a central asset. So you have incredibly high capacity utilization and efficiencies and economies of scale. Now, if you think about all these ghost kitchens coming out there, they're tiny little kitchens doing 200 or 300 orders a day. And that is sort of the problem, not the problem for the world, but if you're going to do 200 meals a day, you're never going to get to a low price point. It's only when you do 300,000 meals a day that you get to a really low price point. So everybody coming up with these sort of additional kitchens, I think it's great for, affluent people. It's the same thing we're talking about. It's great for affluent people who want a better delivery experience, but none of these things are going to lower the cost of a fresh prepared meal under $10, which is what you really need to make a difference in most of America's life.
Got it. And I'm sure we can geek out on this. I know I have a hard stop in a few minutes. Something I love to do, Sam, and something that actually resonated with me quite closely, because I sort of had my own troubled upbringing in terms of, I would get into trouble a lot at school, and I listened to you talk about your background, and I'd love to hear just a little bit about how you went from maybe growing up in your family, having some trouble in college, to not just starting this business, but maybe any like lifestyle changes you've made in your own life in order to make sure that you're living not just in alignment with your values, but in alignment with your health.
Yeah, I mean, I would say so. I think what you're referring to is, so I grew up in a family in Los Angeles, mom and dad, and a lot of respect for them and a lot of love for them. And they will, I would say this in front of them, but they were not they did not provide the sort of most stable sort of childhood home. So like my growing up had a lot of chaos and anger and family trouble and just a lot of sort of like intensity, and in a lot of ways I was sort of like underparented, so I was sort of like on my own a lot. And so one of the things that I think about now is actually sort of like how grateful I am for some of that. Some of that still hurts, to be honest, but a lot of that is like, you put me somewhere and I'll figure out, how to sort of make things happen, because that's just what I've done sort of my whole life. It's like, skills I learned sort of very early on that I think have sort of helped me tremendously as an entrepreneur. But as far as sort of like my own life, like, my biggest mission in life, and it's even, to be honest, it's probably more important to me than Everytable, is to give my kids a sort of solid, stable, sort of love-filled home. And I sort of got lucky with a sort of amazing wife who sort of did not sort of grow up in the same sort of craziness that I grew up in, and so she sort of is a big reason that sort of like I'm able to do that in some level. But not all that matters to me, but one of the most important thing that matters to me is like, being home for dinner every single night and putting my kids to bed every night and not losing my temper and not like, losing it sort of that was, in a way that was sort of like par for the course in my childhood. And so like, on some level, like my life has become sort of very simple, where it's just like, it's Everytable and family. And that's basically it.
Yeah. Your work becomes family too. So it's just like you're a family man at all times. Have there been any sort of specific things you've done in order to like, I don't know, I know it might sound funny, but be in that vibration of love? Like, do you meditate, do you exercise, or is it just like minimalism, just bringing it down to those two things?
Well, no, it is a minimalism. It is, I've actually like my actual like functional thing is like, now I've got an office set up in the garage with a walking treadmill. So I work on that every day. And then I go visit with my kids, 3 or 4 times a day and have lunch with them, et cetera. So, the coronavirus has been tough, but it's been good for the family stuff. That's for sure.
My dad does that too. He has a walking treadmill at his office, and I look up to him, and I wish he was working at home and we were all working together. Sam, thank you so much. It's been awesome finally meeting you. I've been watching Everytable from the sidelines, eating your food and enjoying it, and meeting your team. And I'm excited for people in the JOON community to learn, if they haven't already, about what you guys do, and to go check out Everytable. I know you guys are just LA based right now.
Yeah, although we're going to expand to our first, actually maybe 2 additional regions next year.
Okay, fantastic. And where are those?
Probably San Diego, maybe San Francisco, but also likely New York.
Okay, beautiful. Anything else you'd like to share?
Just about team, like, I get to talk on great podcasts like this, but the truth of it is that none of this could happen, if not for an incredible team of incredibly sort of mission-driven, passionate people that work with me every day that I'm eternally grateful for.
Everytable team, we love you.
We love you.
Thank you, Sam.
Thanks, John.